After Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, the media situation had improved, but now we are seeing a significant backslide. How do you evaluate the press freedom situation in Ethiopia currently?
Sure. So let's go back to those initial days when everyone looked at Ethiopia and thought that Ethiopia would be the good news story. In 2018, when we had our annual prison census, there was not a single journalist in jail in Ethiopia. What I do remember is how, in fact, Addis was host that following year, right? And Prime Minister Abiy was there quoting CPJ figures, and everyone had the sense of positivity. And we saw things decline over the years until last year, of course, when the state of emergency was declared, and we suddenly saw an even bigger crackdown on journalists. And the majority of journalists that we had on our prison census were in fact arrested post that state of emergency. And at one stage, we had at least 14 journalists in jail in Ethiopia. And that made Ethiopia the second worst jailer of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa. In Africa, with Egypt leading on the number of journalists behind bars, you would then say that Ethiopia was the third worst. But in sub-Saharan Africa, back up there as second. And that's why I say it is now the bad news story. It is the one that you look at and you think an opportunity lost, a massive opportunity lost.
You mentioned earlier how Egypt is the one with the most journalists in jail. But at 25, there are fewer than in the past. So does that mean that there is somewhat an improvement in the media environment? And then also, what is the overall impact of these crackdowns and arrests? Does it, create more self-censorship, or the number of maybe journalists practicing on the decline?
The fact that there are less journalists in jail in Egypt this year means that things have improved? Well, certainly not. It hasn't improved. And what you've seen in terms of years of arrests of journalists and a crackdown on journalists is that space for independent journalism gets smaller and smaller. Either journalists leave, they stop working as journalists, or they self-censor. What I can also say, of course, is that how many months later, and we still have 25 journalists in jail in Egypt. So it's not as though there's a sense that they might be released after a couple of months, right, or a couple of weeks. They are still there.
Looking at the East African region, like specifically like in Rwanda, what most people see as a thriving nation on many spectrums, but also with 7 journalists behind bars, majority of them being YouTubers. Can you speak a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So of course, there is a disconnect between Rwanda and the international image that it may have as a development state. You often hear people say, oh, the streets are so clean in Kigali and so on and so on. But what you don't see is what's happening behind the scenes and the crackdown and the censorship on free expression. In fact, Rwanda, in terms of our prison census for last year, in sub-Saharan Africa, overtook Cameroon as the worst jailer of journalists, became the third worst jailer. You've seen people moving to a new platform to express themselves. And you see that in other countries as well. So you have your traditional platforms, newspapers, television, and so on. But suddenly people are expressing themselves on YouTube, on social media. And so what we've seen is of the 7 journalists currently in jail in Rwanda, 6 of them are actually YouTubers. And again, as we've seen in Ethiopia, what you have is a sense that it's arbitrary arrests, arbitrary detention. This is what we're talking about in Rwanda, and we have not seen any improvement. That is over and above issues that obviously one needs to be concerned about in terms of surveillance. It is a surveillance state. And what does that mean for journalists and others wanting to express their opinions? You see the self-censorship. And unfortunately, that is another bad news story for sub-Saharan Africa, is Rwanda.
So thank you for all of that, Angela. But when we move to West Africa, We see that there has been a new trend in missing journalists, with Olivier Dubois abducted on April 8th last year. So it's been more than a year since he was kidnapped by a jihadist group. Can you tell us about some of the cases of missing journalists in that region, including Mali?
Sure. So Mali is the one case that is top of mind for many people, obviously because of the first anniversary, where Olivier Dubois was actually, went to interview a jihadist leader and was then kidnapped. And we've only had 2 videos in which we have heard him talk and where he makes an appeal to the French authorities. Olivier Dubois is a French journalist to assist in his release. We're also investigating 2 other cases of journalists in Mali who have also, we've been told, have been abducted. I cannot tell you now for sure that in fact there are 3 journalists who have been abducted by jihadist groups in Mali, because we're still investigating the 2. But if you look elsewhere in the region, missing journalists, I mean, let's just look in the neighboring country to mine. I'm South African, in Mozambique. For more than 2 years now, we've had a journalist, Ibrahim Mbarouk, who has been missing. His last words as he left his office, he sent an SMS message to a colleague to say, "I'm surrounded by soldiers." That's the last thing we have heard from him. He was working in Cabo Delgado, as you and your viewers, listeners may well know, is obviously an area that is full of conflicts, where there has been a massive crackdown because of the instability and the conflict, and journalists are caught up in there. So you actually also have censorship there, where the authorities obviously don't want journalists to do their work and to expose what is going on.